Canada has a long history of heavy metal. In fact, some say the very phrase heavy metal comes from the 1968 hit Born to be Wild by Toronto rock band Steppenwolf. Canadian bands like Annihilator, Sacrifice, Slaughter and Anvil were at the forefront of thrash.
They were a great band, yeah. I always liked Anvil.
From Quebec province came world-class death metal from Gorguts, Cryptopsy, and Cataclysm. Over the years, we've had our own metal magazines, music video shows, and made our mark on a variety of genres, from glam to nu metal. We may not have one Canadian metal sound, but we've got Devin Townsend, Blood Ceremony, and Protest the Hero. And don't even get us started on Voivod and Rush, eh? Still, being a Canadian metal band today isn't easy. As the second largest country in the world, touring here can be a bitch. This year, Canada's biggest metal festival is on hiatus, and our National Music Industry Conference is happening this week, but has no metal acts at all. And just look at this sad wiki page. It's high time we discuss our own metal scene. So today on Lock Horns, it's all about Canada. Banger TV's live weekly metal debate show coming to you straight from the Banger Bar. Reminder, if you are watching this in the archive, we do go live every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And you know what? We've cracked the 75K subscriber mark. So please, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to Banger TV. We want to reach 100K before the end of the year. Okay, enough of that. This week in Toronto, it's Canadian Music Week. It's Canada's National Music Industry Conference. But you know what? There's no metal bands playing. That's right, no metal at all. So here at Banger, we decided to do something about that, and we'd celebrate Canadian metal all on our own. So this week on Lock Horns, it's about all things Canada. And to help me with this perilous exercise are these three illustrious metal experts. Thank you for joining me. To my immediate right, I have Sarah Lutz. Sarah is a marketing and PR manager, a former booking agent and band manager, and the owner of Looters, whose clients include Metal Blade Records, Hopeless Records, and she has worked with Canadian bands like Exalt, Misery Signals, Protest the Hero, Cursed, Rammer, Fuck the Facts, and Cancer Bats, and international acts such as Epica and All Shall Perish. She also puts up with us when we're doing Banger TV interviews, and I keep saying, just one more question. To her right is JJ Tartaglia. Thanks for joining us, JJ. JJ is the drummer for Toronto's Juno Award-nominated Skullfist, founder of the indie label Boonsdale Records, and works with Wacken Metal Battle Canada. He's originally from Cape Breton on the East Coast and has been touring Canada and the world since the ripe old age of 15. He's actually just 16. This guy's super young and just returned from Inferno Fest in Norway. I am jealous. That's a great part of the world. Next to him is a familiar face to Banger TV viewers. It's Bradley Zorgdrager, the man who has officially the most metal last name of all time. He's the metal and hardcore editor and sponsorships and promotions manager at Exclaim, Canada's leading music publication, and runs the Aggressive Tendencies YouTube channel. You may also know him, as I mentioned, as a regular Overkill reviewer on Banger TV and a past guest for Lock Horns on Deathcore and our Metal in Fashion debate. Welcome. Thanks for joining me. I need to catch my breath. We'll get into this. And also, of course, joining us is everyone out there. I want to give a shout out to everyone that's joining us from around the world. It's global as usual. We have viewers from Lithuania, Wales, Austria, Scotland, Denmark, Portugal, France, Netherlands, Finland, India, UK, Serbia, Poland, Venezuela, and Colombia. And we've got Canadians from Antigonish. Antigonish. I'm West Coast. I'll never get that right. Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Ontario. We got people, Ontarians from Peterborough, Ottawa, Oshawa, Dresden, Chatham, Toronto, Kitchener, London, Quebec City, and Montreal, Quebec. We've got folks from Newfoundland and Saskatchewan as well. You know the drill. We want to hear your opinions on Canadian metal. We don't just want to hear vacuous comments about your favorite Canadian metal bands. We want to hear your in-depth thoughts on the state of Canadian metal. And the mistress of puppets, of course, is Lisa Ladissour. Hi, Lisa.
We are a Canadian show, but we're in Toronto, so no one can pronounce my last name.
That's right.
Including Sam Dunn.
Not even me. It's a big country. And I come from the other side. Okay, enough of that. What is Canadian metal is really one question we're tackling on today's show. We know that there's a lot of metal bands in this country, but we're not sure anyone outside Canada actually knows this. And so we want to get started with some questions. Lisa, are we going to the board first for comments, or do you want me to ask the guests first?
Well, what I'd like to do first is show people at home what happened when I posted this show on Facebook and asked them for their suggestions of Canadian music that they like. Post a video, post a Bandcamp link. We got over like 600 replies to that.
Canada has a long
counting,
history of heavy
hundreds
metal.
of bands.
In fact,
so it kind of boggles the mind that you just don't see that many metal showcases at festivals, because we clearly have a lot of bands. And so I wanted to just thank the people for those suggestions. And if you're watching the show in the archive, you can go to our Facebook and get linked to like so many styles of music while you're watching.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get into it. We don't want you to just be lumps on the log on the show. So, Sarah, how would you describe the Canadian metal scene right now?
As it stands right now, as someone who works in the industry, I'd say it's very lackluster and small. Yes, there's a lot of bands out there, but knowing about them and getting them to showcase on these types of festivals that are like happening this week is very hard. And it's sad and it really sucks. But I wish it kind of was different. I know the past like 2010 and 2004, I personally did my own showcase for Canadian Music Week.
Yep.
One was a Metal Blade showcase when we had signed Bison and Barnburner, and we had other bands like starring Janet Leigh and Assassinate the Following Play. And before in 2004, it was like Hearst and Protest the Hero, right when those bands were kind of up and coming. Other than those showcases that I did, it just doesn't happen. And I don't know if the disconnect is bands not applying, because I would love to hear from the bands if they are applying and just not getting picked, or if it is the festival kind of skewing the genres in the way that these shows are happening.
Okay.
Now, sometimes big shows do happen, like Noel will bring in bigger bands.
Sure.
And the festival will co-pro with him, but I don't think that the festival themselves have ever brought in a bigger band.
It's always been a big challenge in a big country with not a lot of people for the size. JJ, what's your perspective on the metal scene in Canada right now?
I think it's niche. Obviously, it's metal, right? But from my perspective, I seem to think it's pretty thriving, just based on the amount of talent and just really high quality metal bands that we have in general in the country. Definitely, there's some gaps to fill there, like industry-wise. Like it's hard for bands to make it outside of the country or get across the country for touring and to make it worthwhile. But I think in general it's pretty great, especially for our population that we have. I think the ratio of bands that we have is pretty good.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's a country that's always had a lot of talent. It's whether that talent translates into impact, I think, beyond the country. For you, Brad, what's your perspective on how things are going right now?
I mean, I think that we have a lot of good bands. I think there's kind of almost a glass ceiling on it as far as breaking through. A lot of bands don't. There's a band that I was working with before, they were called Mad Trapper, and it was like, how long can you tour around Ontario and Quebec? So the choice kind of becomes, suck it up, throw down the money for a work visa, and spend all that money and go into America, or don't. And then eventually, I would assume the passion just dies eventually. It's like, we can't play these same markets to the same 20 kids. And, getting out west is similarly difficult. You've got like the Western Ontario and then the Manitoba, Saskatchewan, where like shows can, and I've been on tours where shows there have been great, but the population just isn't there just isn't the population to be as financially beneficial for the bands.
Let me ask you about that. I mean, you bring up the regions. Obviously, Canada's physically second largest country in the world, but only 35 million people. We're 1/10 the size of the United States in terms of population. Quebec has always had the reputation in Canada as being kind of like the leaders or the most thriving scene. Is that still the case in your opinion? What are you seeing in terms of like how the different scenes across the country are developing?
Well, I mean, there are great bands still from Quebec. I mean, one that I had a band name, but I can't remember now.
So many.
Phobocosm from Quebec, and they were
So I think metal band names are by far the hardest to remember.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, let's be honest. Let alone spell them.
Yeah, no, seriously. And then there's a new, I can't remember the name of it. There's a new grindcore festival out in Quebec this year. There's I mean, obviously Heavy Montreal.
Yeah.
So there is definitely still a scene there, but I mean, as far as the West Coast, I mean, there's Modified Ghost Festival. Then there's a bunch of festivals throughout like the prairies. Like there's one 420 Music Festival and Loud as Hell, and I think there's another couple kind of. I'd say probably each province out there kind of has its own. And as far as bands, I mean, to me, like the most thriving Canadian sound right now is like the abyssal death metal. It sounds like it was recorded in a cavern with some black metal influences, and there's some of those bands from out west. There's like Mitochondrion and Auroch, and then like from out here there's like Tomb Mold and Abyss and Adversarial. And I mean, I think part of that doing so well is that Profound Lore Records is based in Kitchener, Ontario, and he's a very good Chris is a very good supporter of that sound. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's two kind of capitals of metal in Canada now. Like the Quebec thing, I think will always be a thing. Sure. But certainly out west is flying the flag.
Yes.
We have comments.
We have comments.
So
It's not just us.
Yes.
Okay.
I enjoy the sound of your voice, Bradley. Don't get me wrong.
Thank you.
But
We really do.
We do have a chat going. Here,
Okay,
so
let's go to the chat. First up, we've got Darcy John Kirk Ibsen on Facebook, who says the bands that have put Canadian metal on the map didn't get there by doing pay-to-play corporate wankfests. Well put. I don't think it's worthwhile to go through that much trouble to court the attention of publishers, labels, etc., who pretty much, as a rule, aren't interested in metal, period. The bigwigs attending CMW at North by Northeast, our other big annual music event here in Toronto, aren't looking for the next municipal waste. They're looking for fresh, marketable acts with broad appeal that can succeed across multiple platforms. If you want your band to go places, write great songs, play them like you mean it, and play them for people who are listening. Moving on, we've got Dark Agnes Doom, who says amazing bands all over the place, but industry support is tough. Count Blagarath, the most metal tagline in the chat. As always, the biggest problem with Canadian metal is the regulations for outside bands to come in. How can a scene thrive when bands can't come to play that would bring in people? In terms of black metal, Canada has the best scene going right now between the war metal sound and what Quebec has been bringing to the table for the last 10 years. And Mr. Unknown Person 64 says the scene in Ottawa, at least, is full of too many core bands. We need more classic style bands. Jealous of you guys in Toronto. Come on, you guys have got Cauldron, Axion, Manacle. I'm from an Ottawa band. Lycanthrope. Yowid says the state of Canadian metal is in its own bubble. Hardly anyone knows about it, but yet it has made a big influence on not only American acts, but also bands across the world. For example, Anvil and Lee Aaron. So obviously a lot of different opinions, some more positive than others there from people who are watching.
Yeah, I mean, some of these people are in bands in Canada. Some of them are looking at us from outside. But the fact that people are bringing up Lee Aaron in like 2017, I think is telling in terms of what people know about Canadian metal music.
Right. Yeah, and again, as we've talked about already, there's that issue that there's a lot of talent, but there's that gap between the talent and actually making an impact. Lisa, we want to move on to... Is it guest choice time?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still doing guest choice, even though we have a panel.
Are we giving JJ the reins? Is that how this is working?
Yeah, everyone gets a pick.
Just because he's in a band called Skullfist, he gets extra special treatment? Pretty much.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
I support
I'll take
that.
that.
Okay,
I'm down.
so
Okay, then.
what we like to do on Lockhorns when it's, on any of the episodes, whether it's a genre of metal or essential albums, we like to give a guest a pick for what they consider to be their choice. What's that choice for you?
My choice, hands down, is Devin Townsend Project.
Okay, and why would it be Devin?
I guess it's him, I
Uh-huh.
mean, he's been doing it for so long, and his dedication to just metal
Right.
in general, starting with Strapping Young Lad, back in the day, was just been like he's an icon for metal worldwide, and everyone looks up to him. He's never strayed in any way from his path, and I think that's very admirable for me.
Well, JJ's just continued the track record of Devin Townsend officially being mentioned in every single episode of Lockhorns. So if that doesn't warrant a clip, I don't know what does. So here, we're going to take a look at Devin here, and we'll be back in a sec. Well, there you go. The aggressive yet ethereally soothing sounds of Devin Townsend. He always manages to come up a lot of love for Devin Townsend on the show. Speaking of which, we've got Manan Dedia says, Devin Townsend, fuck yes. He is the mad magician of metal. His influence is pole to pole, coast to coast. Indian metal scene was hugely influenced by Devin. That's good to hear. RV Henriksen says Devin Townsend is a vocalist on par with Freddie Mercury. Big words there. Jorge de Abreu says modern metal would not be the same without Devin Townsend and Strapping Young Lad. City is remarkable and a turning point for the genre, convincing people. Lastly, says Devin Townsend is very talented and does nothing for me.
It's still a Lockhorn show, right? So
I had to read it twice to try and mess that up. I'm like, something doesn't equal the other part. Anyway, in general, a lot of love for Devin, so I think you've got a lot of allies out there, JJ. But I want to change gears, I guess, slightly here and step back in time. I mean, I think with the exception of, say, a Rush, when a lot of people talk about the history of Canadian metal, they tend to go back to the 80s. There was a pretty burgeoning thrash and death metal scene at that time. Of course, Anvil playing a large part in kicking it off. So many regional bands that we don't have the time to get into right now. But of course, we had Sacrifice, we had Slaughter, we had Razor, Annihilator, of course, and if I haven't mentioned Voivod already, I'll mention them again. Really important band, not only in Canada, but internationally as well. But I wanted to ask you guys, I mean, this is a big question, but most of those bands really didn't make much of an impact on the global scale. They're celebrated bands generally within Canada. I mean, Anvil's a bit of an exception, I suppose, obviously big part because of the movie. But any theories on, why didn't those bands make any impact beyond these borders? Anybody?
I mean, I would assume that it wasn't as difficult to tour back then. I think you could just drive through the border. So
Right.
I don't think it was that. But I mean, maybe the drives between places were even more difficult back then, you know. So I don't know if that has that much bearing on it, the logistics side of things.
Right.
I mean,
At the same time, maybe it was more difficult to make it out to places like Europe back in those days, like before the European Union or anything like that. Like maybe going to South America was a huge deal, I imagine, or, Japan or something like that. Like maybe tapping into those markets was a lot harder, and maybe that's why they didn't, conquer as globally as they should have.
I also think like in that time, that was kind of the first time period within metal where we saw an oversaturation with all these bands.
Right.
And obviously we know now, being from Canada, with the oversaturation that's happening in the States, it's even 3 times as hard for a Canadian band to break in the States. So maybe back then, being the beginning of the saturation, the Anvil, of course, they toured the U.S. and I'm sure they got on some really great festivals and some really great tours. But did they kind of ever get out of that first and second kind of slot? That that would definitely be something to look at.
So, do you think it's a big question? Do you think it's easier now than then?
Even so, when I was an agent before, I would always tell bands who I worked with in the metal genre, don't tour the States, go to Europe. And as you probably know, Europe is a lot more cheaper to tour for a Canadian band. The visas are less expensive. The flights are maybe a little bit more expensive, but they actually take care of you more like a Canadian family over in Europe than they do in the States. So
obviously
it
Europe
kind of evens out, I think.
And Europe, obviously, this. You can be in another country in 2 hours, and it can be a whole different market. And you've got a lot of different cities fairly closely packed together. I mean, the States there's a lot of people in the States, but there's also huge sections of the States where there aren't a lot of people, similar to Canada. So it's certainly in Europe you've got that benefit of being able to jump from city to city. Lisa, what's next?
Comments, always comments.
Okay, bring on the comments. Are we
Here
at
we
the top
go.
there?
Yeah,
We got
Horror
Horror Master, one of the 4 horsemen, 6 horsemen, 7. How many we got now? Anyway, let's not forget about Exciter. You're right, I didn't mention Exciter. Along with Annihilator, they showed that Canada can produce some of the best thrash albums of all time. I mean, Heavy Metal Maniac is such a killer album. Raphael Fireblade, Exciter must be here. One of the most important bands in Canada and one of the first fast speed thrash bands, and continues to go strong till this day. Chitalica says Anvil is the legend. Many people think of them first, like them or not, when Canada metal is mentioned. Time Signature MMA, the first Canadian metal band I ever heard about back in the 80s was Anvil, whose Metal on Metal album was a masterpiece in my world back when I was a kid. Corrigal Exterminator, for those that know, it's a beautiful homage to Voivod's second record. I think Annihilator are pretty overrated by Canadians. I'm not sure they are world-class metal. Sorry, the fact that you said sorry, I don't need to finish that line, right? They're Canadian for sure. They said sorry. Don't apologize for your opinions about metal. Deviant Red says Annihilator has a great audience overseas. They rarely ever play in Canada with the exception of this upcoming summer tour. Dark Agnes Doom is back. I don't think what Sam is saying is true. You're starting to sound like Lisa. Particularly in speed metal realms, people talk about Razor, Exciter, Sacrifice, and Slaughter in exalted terms. Not sure what we're disagreeing about on there. Anyway, I move on. Jamie Laszlo. During the dawn of metal, there was Triumph. People forget, Triumph played the US Festival, one of the biggest music festivals at its time, 1983. Motley Crue, Van Halen. Anyway, people forget Triumph was there. They could actually pack an arena in the early 80s, and at that time were considered metal. I think it would be a shame if they didn't get a mention. Well pointed out.
All right, there you go.
Follow your heart.
Follow.
Showing my age to you.
I'm not singing it. I was so close to singing it, but I feel like I'm not.
I felt it coming.
Feeling like I'm wearing not the right outfit. Maybe JJ could do it off camera. Great. Guest choice, Sarah.
Sarah, you get your guest choice for the Canadian metal band that you want to gush about.
I really like Dead Quiet from BC, Vancouver, BC. The singer Kevin, I've known him in previous bands before, and I actually really think as he progresses every year and just kind of joining new bands, his vocal styles are really getting better. And with this new lineup of the band, I want the world to see them.
Awesome. I'm always up for some good metal from BC. Lisa, are we going to a clip or are we moving on?
We sure are.
Okay, here's some Dead Quiet. Check it out.
Rolling on the
So, I mean, another thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is like production values of videos is going through the roof, and the ability for bands to produce videos has become, it's a very different story than in the 80s and the bands I was mentioning earlier. But on that point, so I think looking back, with the exception, as I mentioned, of Rush, I think the first Canadian metal scene that was kind of, we could call kind of like a movement, was that sort of late 80s, early 90s thrash slash death metal sound I was referencing earlier. But Bradley, you're going to talk a bit about post-hardcore and metalcore and what that scene is up to these days in Canada.
I mean, even before that was a thing, there is a hardcore scene. There's bands like No Warning, Figure 4, who members went on to form Comeback Kid, Go It Alone. And then, you get into like the more metalcore thing. And I think this kind of really illustrates what happened with bands just not breaking through. Arise and Ruin and Farewell to Freeway were both signed to Victory Records at the time, one of the biggest record labels going, and neither really, I mean, I'm sure they went over there to tour, but neither really broke over there. And I think that's indicative for every band, that's like Cancer Bats or Counterparts, the bands that actually do break through. There are bands, like Holly Springs Disaster, massive in Canada, sold out the Danforth, 1,500 people 2 nights in a row on a reunion, like Roses Dead, The Gorgeous, bands that were, I Hate Sally, great bands, but like they never really broke through. And I think the thing about those bands is it's almost more ripe for breaking through because there is such a crossover appeal, not to just true metalheads, which, maybe there aren't as many necessarily in North America as there are in Europe, where, Wacken is. So there is that crossover, so it's almost more likely to happen, but even then there's still a lot of, failed cases. I mean, there was also, the death metal scene we were talking about in Quebec. There's also the deathcore scene that came out of Quebec with bands like Despised Icon and Ion Dissonance, Beneath the Massacre, The Last Felony. All these bands were successful. I mean, obviously some in varying degrees, but I'd say that was probably, I don't think this whole metalcore thing is necessarily a movement in the same way that the thrash metal, death metal thing was, and then the deathcore thing. And I don't think I said that kind of cavernous death metal thing. I think that's probably, as far as what I'm following, is the most like exciting movement-based thing. But even then, it's just way more underground, I think. Right. So I mean, I'd say if we were to talk about the two main sounds, it would be those two, and Quebec as a home to that sound.
Well, I think we've got some comments on the board about this sound, Lisa.
We certainly do. I saw Brighton Rock go by, and I thought now is the time to change the subject.
Oh, yeah, good thing it wasn't Honeymoon Suite.
Before we go there. But we do have some people, Bradley, you have some peeps.
Okay, Bradley's got peeps. That's good. Diego Diablo says, fun fact. It's our first fun fact ever on Lockhorns. Canadian band DOA, yes, invented the term hardcore punk. Shout out to Joe Keithley, who was a guest here in Banger Bar last year. Raphael Fireblade, Protest the Hero, has to be here, taking Canadian metal prog to the extreme, and their album Kezia is a driving force to modern Canadian metal bands. Convincing People says that Despised Icon and Ion Dissonance were two of the earliest bands to bring grindcore, screamo, mathcore, and power violence techniques and styles into a death metal context. Essential. Incidental note. It's our first incidental note, too, on Lockhorns. Why no Ion Dissonance in the deathcore episode? Bradley?
It came down to influence. I think they're a great band, but I just think Despised Icon was bigger and more worshipped. I think Ion Dissonance maybe went a little bit over some of the deathcore kids who just like the breakdowns or went over their head. There was too much going on.
Well handled. Good job.
Great band. Not anything to take away from them. You should definitely listen to them, but there's that line you have to walk between good band and influence, and sorry.
There you go. Convincing People. Are you convinced? By Bradley. Rob Naylor says Ion Dissonance are second only to Dillinger Escape Plan in terms of mathcore. Cast the First Stone was an incredible album, a top 10 of 2016. Okay, so few lovers out there, maybe a hater or two. Yeah, Lisa?
So here's an interesting comment that just came in from X Sinner.
Okay.
I did not know Protest the Hero were Canadian. Amazing
Yeah.
band. I'm seeing actually a lot of this in the chart. Didn't know blank was Canadian. Sarah, I know you have a few thoughts about that.
Tell us.
Yes, I think a lot of it has to do with the media. It has to do with the people behind the scenes, as you may like to call them, puppet masters, as far as publicists go, as far as the labels go. When these Canadian bands are getting signed and either they're getting licensed out or they're getting international label deals, and you know the labels are working on their bio and they're working on timelines and all of these other things. Other than the passive flippant mention of like, oh, protester from Oshawa, Ontario. That's all you really see, maybe in the first or two press releases, and then that's about it. Obviously, the Canadian press loved them, and they covered them, and everyone from Canada, mostly I would say everyone from Canada, know who they were. They put the time in, they toured the country, they spoke about the country, they actually took other bands out from the area, they really supported it, but outside, everywhere else, the publicists, the labels, other bands that they toured with, like nothing about Canada was mentioned.
I think this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, I've been to Wacken and talked to fans there, and you know, I'll mention bands even like Annihilator or Sacrifice, sort of some, you know, bands that older bands that have that kind of cult following, and people don't know they're from Canada. I think this is just part of the syndrome of being little brother next door to big brother. I mean, we sound a certain way. People kind of know maybe we're not European when it comes to our metal style, so people just assume that a lot of those Canadian bands are from the US. So it's definitely not something new in my experience. Lisa, are we moving on to Brad's choice, perhaps?
Yeah, we're going to keep it moving to talk about new bands here on the show today, again, because Sam can talk about Sacrifice for a long time. It always comes back around to that.
We've only got 50 minutes, so let's not start. Bradley, your choice.
I'm choosing the band Six of Swords. They're a death metal band from Toronto. It's almost as if like Crowbar were playing Cannibal Corpse and Obituary and Domination Era Morbid Angel riffs. I've been following the band since their first show. I'm pals with them, and I've been trying to help them. And just recently, I've been seeing a lot of, they played a show with Nails and Gatecreeper and Toxic Holocaust, and they played with Homewrecker. They're playing with Shed the Skin, and the reception that they're getting is definitely moving in the right direction, and it's very exciting for them. And I think more people should hear them. So
well, I want
that's
to
my
hear
choice.
it after the Morbid Angel and Obituary references. So here, we're going to have a clip from Six of Swords. Some pretty sweet death metal there. This is highly competent metal music. Check out Six of Swords from right here in Toronto. That's pretty impressive stuff. Okay, we're gonna switch gears a little bit here. We talked a little bit off the top about the industry side of things, touring and promotions, and I wanted to continue that conversation now. A specific question, maybe I'll start with you, Sarah. You know, do you think we have the promoters and the venues to actually properly sustain like a touring circuit in Canada for metal? Do you think that that's actually something we can achieve, or is it too scattered to really? Is it a reasonable expectation that bands can like tour well in this country?
I think bands can tour well here. I mean, obviously, you know, within Northern Ontario, and then you start to kind of the drive from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg. Yes, it's a little dicey. You have to take your time. It is a long drive. Make sure you have gas, all those things. But as long as beautiful,
It looks really
yes. You can see lovely moose on the side of the road. I think as long as bands are told about this in advance,
Right.
that they're prepared. Okay, yes, it's this amount of time that you're going to be out on the road between two cities. Then it's doable. I mean, you know, huge U.S. bands have done it. All touring Canadian bands have done it, because you do want to tour from Newfoundland all the way out to Victoria. You have to tour all of Canada. Coming and doing Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, I constantly want to spit on people when they do that. Oh, we're playing Canada and here are 3 days.
right.
That drives me crazy just as much as the rest of the country.
JJ, I want to get your perspective on this. Do you have any thoughts you want to share on the experience of playing in this country?
I think a good way to do it would be you can break it up, right? So you could focus on a West Coast tour. I mean, because really the empty space is really just in the middle, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of places you can hit out west, and then, you know, you've got the middle part, and then you can do everything east of, you know, Ontario as a separate chunk. So, I mean, it might be a little bit too much to try and tackle the whole thing, you know, especially if you're going out your first time or whatnot. But if you break it up, I think you can do it in a smart way, and where it's totally feasible, and you'll make enough to break even, you know, at least.
Bradley, I wanted to shift to you and talk a little bit specifically about the Aggressive Tendencies tour. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. What happened to the Aggressive Tendencies tour?
So Aggressive Tendencies is the section name essentially for Exclaim's metal and hardcore content. Years ago there was a tour. The one lineup that sticks out in my head is Converge, Cursed, Terror, and Mare. I didn't go. I was, I don't know, too young or whatever. So I still hate myself for that. But yeah, I mean, you know, being that involved with prepping a tour, planning a tour is a very involved thing. And media, you know, is just not the beast it once was, like at least as far as print media goes. So time has had to be allocated into other things. I actually got an email from Lisa, and this was included in part of it, and I went up and asked the boss of Exclaim what happened, and that's the gist of it, is just timing. And I said, well, can I do it? And he said, yeah. So as of yesterday, I've begun work on an Aggressive Tendencies tour. Tentatively for maybe spring next year.
Great. Good luck with that. I mean, that whole concept of like the branded tour package has become kind of a staple. We've got the Decibel tour, of course, and others. So it seems to be, at least there's been some viable templates for that. Obviously, most of them coming from the US. So.
And speaking of like, you know, how you're speaking of doing the West Coast and the East Coast, I was like, well, do we keep the tour all Canadian, or do we, you know, go into America? And I think the one way to maybe get around like the Western Ontario thing is you do, you know, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, somewhere in Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, and then you like dip down, you go into like Chicago, Detroit, and maybe you could even do like a little run in the Northeast states and then come back in up here. So I don't know what we'll end up doing. Knock on wood that it actually happens for the Aggressive Tendencies tour, but you know, a lot of people view West Coast as Vancouver or Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and those other markets, like I've been there on tour, they aren't as prosperous, but they're prosperous enough. If you're a band who should be touring, you can definitely be there. And I think it's not right to ignore them all the time.
Well, and in my limited experience playing in bands and doing a little bit of touring, it's, you know, some of those smaller markets, like, you're not going to get as many people out, but you might be able to charge a little bit more because people don't get as many bands coming to town, and B, you know that the people that are there are going to be there the next time around because there's sort of there's that loyalty that comes from playing those smaller markets, and that can grow over time, right? I mean, you take even a band like Rush, we talked about it in the film, like they were touring like twice a year to places like Omaha, Nebraska, and at that time, like bands just didn't do that. Obviously, this is a very different time. This is a time of like where arena tours were more flourishing, but it really paid off for them in the long run. And they roll into Omaha now and play to 15,000 people, and no one else can do that. So I think maybe there's some small lessons to be learned about, like, to your point, there's more to Canada than just playing Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal.
I also think it's important to play those smaller towns because it's not just the people who are coming to your show. Those are also the people who might like go and buy the pre-order of your new album or the special limited edition package of like the t-shirt and the hat and all of those things. So you get more than just a fan. And a lot of times, you sounds gay, but you get a lifelong friend and someone who you can always count on when you go to that town or city.
And you're inspiring younger musicians to start bands of their own by doing that, by going to these small towns where they don't get a chance to see bands.
That's right.
And also, if you're, you see a band early on in their career, or you see them in that intimate setting, it makes them special to you, and it makes that connection that makes you maybe want to buy that bigger package. Just like I saw this band, when this band plays Toronto, they play 600 people. I saw them play in a 200 cap venue here with 150 people, and it was awesome. And then people, they just like latch onto that band a little bit more. So there's beyond the fact that you might be making a little bit less money. It's like a sentimental connection for these people, and they
don't underestimate the long-term potential of playing some of those smaller markets, to use the business speak. Yes, Lisa.
We have a lot of people who want to talk about their favorite Canadian metal bands, and we will try and get to some of those.
Yes.
But I know that you have a guest choice.
I have a guest choice.
That is lingering.
I'm not even a guest, and I get a guest choice.
You get a host choice.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That's called double dipping. Anyway, my choice is a band from the lower mainland of British Columbia called Ancients. Maybe we'll go to the clip first, and then I can tell you about why they're amazing. Here. Sort of hanging on a cliff's edge there just before that song kicks into the heavy part. But Ancients, I think these guys are one of the finest talents in Canada right now. They're kind of in that Opeth, Mastodon, sound, some extreme elements with some guttural vocals, but also some great melodic vocals as well. And I just think I think they've come a long way in their songwriting from the first record to the second record. The first record, I think they were a little guilty of kind of just adding on riff after riff and maybe going for that kind of prog thing, maybe a little too hard. But I think the latest record is really focused and potent. So there's my choice. Check out Ancients if you haven't already. Great Canadian band from out west. Okay, Lisa, are we going to go to some other favorite Canadian bands of other people?
Because there are so many. And before we sort of wrap up the panel discussion, we couldn't do a show about Canadian metal without talking about these bands. We will perhaps do an episode one day where we debate the legend and we make a tree, and these names are sure to come up.
Okay, this is just the start. Here we go. Abhishek Nambiar says, Voivod, Dimension Hatros has to be the best Canadian metal album of all time. If I had to pick a legend of Canadian metal, I would definitely pick Voivod. We're on the same page. Korgel the Exterminator is back. I assume Voivod are getting mentioned soon. Amazing band, and one of the few thrash/extreme bands to progress without sounding like a sellout. Really unique sounding band. No one sounds like Voivod. Moving on, Phil Plankton Cataclysm is the only unique sounding metal band from Canada that has penetrated the thick metal wall we have between Canada and Europe. That's a really good point. Cataclysm is a Canadian band that's made a really strong international impact. Northern Hyperblast. Dizchu says Cryptopsy needs to be mentioned, based purely on Flo Mornier's phenomenal drum work. He's a genius, which is technically amazing, yet not clinical and robotic. Mick Shazam, Sam. Seriously, see, this is how people talk to me. If you don't throw Kitty a bone, I'm going to be very disappointed. Forget about the fact that they're all women in a time where that was even less common in metal, but they had their own style and can't fairly be lumped in with and dismissed alongside the North American nu metal scene. I mean, it's just like we're 45 minutes into discussion. We're just getting to a lot of bands that actually have been fairly successful. Piotr Gieling, Infernal Majesty. There's a band after my heart. People forget about those guys. Could have been Canada's counterpart of Slayer. They were a fantastic band. They surpassed Slayer musically by being way more diverse. They've been around since '86. Thank you. They're a great and largely forgotten Canadian band. Justin Fogarty, Beyond Creation. This is a great band. It's a recent band that has been breaking through from Canada into America and Europe. Amazing tech death relevant to the current scene. Good point, Justin. And Paul Ypres, guess who he's going to talk about? Sam, Wood of Ypres, has one of the biggest underground cult followings in Canada. Absolutely. They won a Juno months after David's death. Rest in peace, David, the leader of Wood of Ypres, a very good band. And yes, Paul says fantastic Canadian doom metal. We could go on.
We could go on. I haven't put them up for you, Sam, but because there's been quite a few people wanting to talk about Skullfist, so maybe we can just ask JJ what's up with Skullfist before we get off the bandwagon.
Oh,
sorry.
You planned that.
No,
JJ,
I didn't.
What's going on?
You know what? I'm gonna cowbell myself.
That's
for
the
that
first
one.
self-cowbell.
I'm shutting up now.
JJ, tell us about what's going on with Skullfist.
Well, so I don't know if everyone knows this, but I guess so Zach's been having some problems with his vocals, which has been delaying the release of our third album.
Right.
So we haven't been able to go in the studio just yet and record it. So he's actually had 2 vocal surgeries done, which he's recovering from, but recovering well. But it's a slow process.
Right.
So I mean, we've still been touring quite a bit since then. So next month we're doing Eastern Europe and Russia. And we've got the Halifax Metal Fest in July, and there might be an East Coast tour along with that.
Let me wedge this question in because I didn't get to it earlier. When you tour internationally and you tell people you're a Canadian metal band, what's the typical what do people say?
Oh, it's great. I mean, they'll be like, "Oh, you're from Canada," right? It's not Canada, it's Canada. And but yeah, I mean, the reaction is always great. You know,
Right.
it's they don't care if you're even if you were a band that they didn't know and they knew you were from Canada, they're going to be like, okay, I'm going to go check this out just because, you know.
And do you feel there's a general awareness of bands, Canadian metal bands, when you talk to people? Or
It's pretty good. I mean, they know the big ones, but like we were talking about before, I think a lot of people would be surprised about how many bands that might be some of their favorites and are actually Canadian and they don't know about it.
Right. It's more that they like those bands and they don't know they're Canadian rather than listing off a bunch of Canadian metal bands that they love. Lisa, are we pulling out the crystal ball for the future?
We're going to talk about the future, but I know each of you have secretly brought a legend choice in your head. And I know that people do want us to do this show. So this is, Sam, you don't know I'm doing this, but I'm going to give you guys the markers.
Okay.
And while I talk about a little project I want the fan chat to do, you guys go ahead, write your legends on the board, and then we'll reveal them to the people.
Okay,
Bradley,
quickly, grab your markers.
Bradley.
This is a first. This is like a homework exercise on the
while
metal
you guys
chalkboard.
do that, I wanna bring something up on screen that we were is in the opening that we found, which is the Canadian Metal Wikipedia page. It is so sad.
This is
very
painful.
very sad. Can you believe how sad this is? So I'm calling out to the people who are in the Lockhorns chat today, the people from Canada and around the world who love this music, who are wiki editors or want to be wiki editors and need a mission. Fix this page. We can do this together, right? Like, Canadian music is more than one picture of Anvil. So if you like our show and you'd like to do Canadian metal a favor, get on there. Let's fix the Canadian wiki page as a Lockhorns summer project. How about that, Sam?
I think that's I think there are worse summer projects than fixing the Canadian metal wiki page. It is kind of pathetic when you account for all of the bands that we've been talking about on this show and how many great bands there are that come out of this country. Anyway, enough of that. Lisa, there's a lot of words on this board.
What's going on over there?
Our guests may or may not have got a little carried away. Well, starting on my end, no surprise, Voivod would be my pick for legendary Canadian metal band. Sarah, who did you write?
Cryptopsy.
Cryptopsy, of course, great death metal from Quebec. JJ?
Annihilator.
Annihilator.
Get set.
Jeff Waters,
Yeah.
bit of a legend, originally from BC. Think he's in Ottawa now, if I've got that right.
Yep.
Bradley, it was supposed to be one band, dude.
Well, I picked Chris Callahan, and he's been in many bands that are usually influential, more on the hardcore side of things. So, you know, Chris Callahan, Cursed, Left 4 Dead, Ruination, Countdown to Oblivion. Currently, he's playing in a band called Sect, with members of Catharsis, Earth Crisis, and the drummer of Fall Out Boy, and Burning Love. So he's been in plenty of hugely influential bands within
Right.
the realm of more hardcore things. So
He's your legend.
He's my legend, and the bands that he has.
Very cool.
produced.
Very cool. There you go. Some diversity, I guess, skewing slightly towards the 80s and 90s, I suppose. But hey, it takes time to be a legend. You got to earn your legendary status. Okay, Lisa, we've got the Wiki campaign.
Yeah,
in motion.
I don't know if it's catching fire, but I'm gonna stay on it. I'll be back.
What do you want to do next?
I think we have one last question
Okay,
For the guests.
from the board.
for the guests
Oh, for the guests.
about how to make things better.
Right. Let's talk about the future of Canadian metal. Let's try and keep these succinct. We'll start at the end with you, Brad. One thing that comes to mind that you think would improve the Canadian metal scene.
Can I do two, if they're
Yes.
really quick? Okay, sick. First of all, Toronto needs to stop closing venues, which I'm sure is probably going to be a problem in other major cities as well. Be nicer to DIY spaces. If they're not doing anybody harm, like if they're not serving alcohol, like,
Right.
and they're in like in a remote location, like fuck off, leave them
Yeah.
alone. Let them have their shows, and then, you know, somehow finding, you know, a way to petition the United States to make the visa process a little bit more friendly, which I think is an ongoing thing. I think the Canadian Federation of Musicians is probably pushing for that and probably always will be. Yeah, those are the two things to kind
Cool.
of really make it more possible for bands to play, and then more people can see the bands and support the bands.
Yeah.
So.
From your perspective, JJ, how can we improve the scene?
I think the industry needs to support the bands more in general. So by that I mean like the labels and managers and bookers need to put in more work on the band's behalf, because the bands in general don't know how to go about getting the funding that they need. Even though the funding is there, it's all over the place, right? Every province has all kinds of funding, and it's just they don't know how to tap into it. They need someone to do it for them. So the labels need to step up and work harder for those bands. Like I think we've seen that with New Damage Records, you know, that the branch off of Dine Alone. I think that's a great example of how, you know, there is an interest there. There is a lot of value for the industry, and it's just about, you know, taking that leap and doing it and working with the bands to get them out there.
Cool. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I'm very much along the same lines as you, JJ. However, don't leave it up to the labels, to the managers. If you're a band out there, go out there and get the money. It is there. You just don't know about it right now, and it is very easy to get. There's provincial, there's provincial funding, there's federal funding that every band can get, and especially a lot of these bands, once they sign to US labels, they don't have the ability to get that funding anymore. So a lot of bands that are starting off fresh, a lot of bands that say, I'm gonna start my own label so I can release my own music, go out and get the funding for your label to do so. The more bands that we have out there trying to get the funding and getting their name out there, the more the press, like, because people who write and who are journalists are on the forms for these fundings to approve them. The more people to see your name out there, the more you'll get covered, the more people who will come to your show, and you'll really start to see the snowball effect. Who knows how far it's going to go, but it's a start.
Yeah. My two bits are, if you're a metal fan, go to a show and buy a t-shirt. It goes directly to the band in an era of declining record sales. As a fan, if you like the music, then I do believe that people should be rewarded for their art. So go to a show, buy a t-shirt. I think I would agree. I think there's a bit of a disconnect. We talked about it off camera before we start, between the bands and the industry. I think bands cannot complain about lack of support unless they actually actively are engaged in the industry and find a way. You can't have it both ways. Like, you can't sit back and say, things suck for us, we want more support, and then not actually do anything about it. Thirdly, on the kind of more macro level, I think that there needs to be sort of more of an awareness of like just how much international impact a lot of these metal bands we've been talking about today have. I don't think there's much awareness in Canada just how much a band like Cataclysm has an impact internationally, and that I think in Canada we tend to get a little bit myopic and closed-minded, and then we tend to just look within ourselves. But people forget how much potential a lot of Canadian bands have internationally. So, but I ramble on. Lisa, we got some comments?
A few, we always have some stragglers.
Okay, here we go. A few comments from the board about the future. Small topic. Otter Tim, maybe you could mention labels like Hypnotic Dirge Records. It's a small Canadian label that works non-profit and is supporting the international underground of doom and black metal. They have amazing young bands in their back catalog. Daniel Robichaud says, open up the fucking border. Yeah, we know that guy down south. I mean, it's not looking good. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. Gutsdozer says, add more dates to the so-called North American tours that only go to 1 or 2 Canadian cities. If bands can't cross borders, play in venues near borders, so more Canadian fans can come. I'd drive down to Bellingham, Washington for a show. This is a great point we didn't have time to get into. I mean, the state of the Canadian-US border right now, particularly the political context, it's only going to get more complicated.
I mean, I think we also touched on the practicality of adding those more dates. Like, there are things to consider, you know, like the long drives and stuff.
Sure.
That's why they come in, they play Toronto and Montreal, and then they leave, because what are they going to play, a city in the middle with half the people? It just it's a utopian view, and I wish that it could happen, but
it's a challenge.
It's a challenge.
But there are the Londons, the Hamiltons, the Oshawas. Vancouver has suburbs like Surrey. Metal bands can go to Surrey and play for a few hundred people. I mean, yeah, you're not going to pull the same audience, but
or
the point here,
there, like you can still go at, like Eastern Canada.
Yeah.
Like those poor people out there are so deprived. And when I was an agent, like
how do you feel about that, Nova Scotia?
would get them out there, like. Yeah, it's so sad. I'm so sorry for these people.
Miss Toronto here. Let's go on. We got anything left? One more. Brian Schuster. People need to spend more money. Brian just boils it right down to us. But I am a firm believer that there is some responsibility in the hands of the fan and listener when it comes to supporting music. I'll say it once. You've heard it a million times. If you don't buy music, it's not going to survive. It's the bottom line. You got to find other ways to survive it. I'll get off my pedestal. Lisa.
Yeah, someone on here named Zed something, Zezair. Sam, are you done yet?
Never. That's the answer. Never.
Yeah, for today.
I think we are done.
Yeah.
So I think that wraps up the Canadian metal in Canada discussion. Thank you, Sarah, JJ, Bradley for joining us. Of course, off camera, we got Lisa, Daniel, Andrew, and Craig. The show is in the archive, of course, if you are watching it live, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Lock Horns returns next week with an Essential Albums debate. We don't know what genre yet. I've heard it's going to be a big one. Lisa won't tell me. She's the boss. Until then, thanks for joining us on Lock Horns. We'll see you next time.